The doorbell rang at exactly 7:18 p.m. Eleanor Hart wasn't expecting anyone. She'd just finished reheating leftover chicken Alfredo from her favorite Italian place on High Street in Columbus when the chime echoed through her quiet ranch-style home. The October evening had settled into that crisp, golden hour where streetlights flickered on and neighbors walked their dogs past manicured lawns. She wiped her hands on a kitchen towel and walked to the door, expecting a delivery, or perhaps a lost DoorDash driver looking for the Henderson house 2 doors down. Instead, when she opened it, the past stood on her porch. Daniel Hart, her husband. The man who vanished from Cleveland 10 years ago without a word, without a note, without a single explanation that made sense to anyone, least of all her. He looked different, broader through the shoulders. His hairline had receded slightly, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. But it was unmistakably him, standing there in dark jeans and a black jacket, wearing a smile that assumed forgiveness had already been granted. "Eleanor," he said, like her name was a greeting and an explanation all at once. She didn't speak. Her hand stayed on the doorknob. That's when she noticed the woman. Younger, maybe late 20s. Long dark hair falling past her shoulders, wearing a beige sweater and holding a toddler dressed in blue pajamas with white stars. And behind her, partially hidden by the porch column, 2 more identical children clung to her legs. Triplets. "This is Mara," Daniel said, gesturing casually. "And these are our children. I know this is unexpected, but we need to talk. Can we come in?" He didn't wait for an answer. He stepped forward, and Eleanor, operating on some autopilot reflex she would later question, stepped aside. Daniel walked into her house like memory still gave him ownership, like 10 years hadn't created a canyon between who he'd been and who he was now. He glanced around the living room, noting the new couch, the updated paint, the framed photo of Eleanor receiving an award from her logistics firm last spring. "You redecorated," he observed. Mara followed, quieter, her eyes taking in everything with the careful assessment of someone entering unfamiliar territory. The children were silent, watching Eleanor with wide, uncertain eyes. Eleanor closed the door. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand explanations or scream about betrayal or ask the 1,000 questions burning in her chest. She simply watched. And that was his first mistake, assuming her silence meant acceptance. "Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if stories about quiet strength, patience, and justice that unfolds not with fire but with ice speak to you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because what Eleanor Hart did next didn't involve screaming, public confrontations, or dramatic revenge plots. It involved waiting, watching, and gathering evidence. And by the time the truth surfaced, Daniel Hart would realize far too late that silence had never been Eleanor's weakness. It had been her weapon. The first year after Daniel disappeared, Eleanor had cried herself hollow. The police had filed a missing person report, but without evidence of foul play, it had gone nowhere. Daniel's car was found at the Cleveland Hopkins International Airport parking garage, suggesting he'd left voluntarily. His bank account had been drained, not dramatically, but methodically. 500 here, 1,000 there, over the course of 3 weeks. By the time Eleanor realized what was happening, he'd taken nearly $18,000. The house they'd bought together in Cleveland Heights suddenly felt enormous and empty. Eleanor had worked part-time as an administrative assistant at a small accounting firm, a job that barely covered utilities. Daniel had been the primary earner, working as a sales representative for a medical equipment company, or so she'd thought. When she'd called his employer after his disappearance, they'd been confused. "Mr. Hart hasn't worked here in 6 months," the HR representative had said. "He resigned last March." That was the first shock. The second came when Eleanor discovered he'd been cashing his paychecks at check-cashing stores instead of depositing them, leaving no bank trail. He'd been planning his exit for half a year while she'd been planning their 10-year anniversary dinner. Year 2 was when Eleanor stopped crying and started surviving. She sold Daniel's truck, the one collecting dust in the garage. She refinanced the house in her name only, which required lawyers and paperwork, and sitting in offices answering questions about why her husband had abandoned her. She took a full-time position at Midwest Logistics Solutions in Columbus, which meant relocating, which meant leaving behind neighbors who looked at her with pity. The job was demanding, coordinating shipments, managing vendors, troubleshooting supply chain disruptions. But Eleanor was good at it. She had a mind for systems and details, for seeing patterns and finding solutions. By year 3, she'd been promoted to project manager. By year 5, she'd stopped checking Daniel's credit report. By year 7, she'd started saying, "I'm single," instead of "it's complicated." By year 10, she'd built a life that worked. A small circle of friends from work, a house that felt like hers, a 401k that was actually growing. She'd even gone on a few dates, though nothing serious. It was hard to trust people with your whole story when the last person you'd trusted had simply vanished. But she'd survived. More than that, she'd thrived. And now, he was back, sleeping in her guest room, acting like absence was just a pause rather than a betrayal. Eleanor got up early the next morning, before dawn. She went for a run through her neighborhood, past houses where porch lights were just starting to flicker on, where someone was already walking their golden retriever. The air was cold and sharp, clearing her head. When she returned, she showered and dressed for work. Professional slacks, a burgundy blouse, minimal jewelry. She made coffee and was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing emails when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Daniel appeared first, wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt. "Morning," he said, helping himself to her coffee maker. "You're up early." "I have work." "Right. Of course." He poured coffee into one of her mugs, the one with the Columbus skyline printed on it. "We should probably talk about logistics today. When you get home." "Logistics," Eleanor repeated. "Yeah, like how long we'll stay, what the financial arrangements look like, how we manage things going forward." Eleanor sipped her coffee. "How long were you planning to stay?" "Haven't really decided. Few months, maybe. Until I can find work and get us set up somewhere permanent." "I see." Daniel leaned against the counter. "I know you probably have questions about where I've been, what I've been doing, and I'll answer them. But right now, I need to focus on the kids, on getting them settled." "Of course," Eleanor said. She stood, rinsed her mug, grabbed her keys and laptop bag. "Eleanor," Daniel called as she headed toward the door. "Thank you for not making this harder than it has to be." She paused, looked back at him. "I haven't decided what I'm making this yet," she said. Then she left. When Eleanor returned from work that evening, the house had been transformed. Children's toys were scattered across the living room floor. Sippy cups and snack containers cluttered the kitchen counter. The television was on, playing some animated show with bright colors and loud music. Mara was sitting on the couch, watching the triplets play with building blocks. She looked up when Eleanor entered, offering a tentative smile. "Hi. Sorry about the mess. It's hard to keep up with 3 of them." "It's fine," Eleanor said, though it wasn't. This was her space, her sanctuary, and it had been invaded by chaos she hadn't invited. Daniel emerged from the hallway. "Good, you're home. We need to talk." He gestured toward the kitchen table, and Eleanor followed, setting down her work bag. Mara stayed in the living room with the children. Daniel had papers spread out on her table, documents, forms, legal-looking printouts. "What's this?" Eleanor asked. "A property agreement." He slid a sheet toward her. "I looked into it. Since I'm still on the deed and we're still legally married, I have rights to this house, but I'm willing to work out an arrangement." Eleanor picked up the paper. It was a cohabitation agreement outlining terms where she and Daniel would essentially split the house with separate living spaces and shared common areas. "You want to split my house," she said flatly. "Our house," Daniel corrected. "Technically, I know you've been paying the mortgage and I appreciate that, but legally, I never signed away my ownership." Eleanor set the paper down. "You abandoned this property 10 years ago." "I didn't abandon it. I stepped away from the marriage temporarily." "For 10 years. Circumstances were complicated." There was that word again, complicated, as if it explained theft, desertion, and now this presumptuous return. "What exactly do you want, Daniel?" He leaned back in his chair. "I want us to coexist peacefully until I can get back on my feet. I'm looking for work. Once I'm employed and save enough, we'll find our own place. But until then, we need somewhere stable for the kids. And you think that somewhere is here?" "Why not? We have history, and you have the space." Eleanor studied him. He was so confident, so assured in his logic, like he'd thought through every angle and decided she'd have no choice but to comply. "I'll need to think about it," she said. "What's there to think about? It's just temporary." "Then you won't mind me taking time to consider it?" Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. "Fine, but don't take too long. We need stability, and the kids need routine." Eleanor stood. "I need to change." She went upstairs to her bedroom and closed the door. Then she sat on her bed and reread the cohabitation agreement. It was professionally written, which meant Daniel hadn't drafted it himself. He'd consulted a lawyer, probably before even showing up at her door. This wasn't spontaneous. It was planned. She thought about his confident entry yesterday, his knowledge of her career, his assumption she'd step aside. Then she remembered something. Daniel had known the alarm code. She'd changed it 4 years ago after a security company recommendation. The new code was her employee ID number, something Daniel couldn't possibly have known unless he'd had access to her information somehow. Eleanor opened her laptop and logged into her bank account. Everything appeared normal. She checked her credit report. Clean. But something was off. She pulled up her home security account and scrolled through the activity log. There it was. The alarm had been disarmed yesterday at 5:45 p.m., 30 minutes before the doorbell rang, which meant Daniel had already been inside her house before announcing his presence. Eleanor's hands stilled on the keyboard. This wasn't a desperate man seeking shelter. This was something else entirely. Eleanor didn't confront Daniel about the alarm code. Instead, she watched. Over the next 3 days, she observed patterns. Daniel woke late, around 10, and spent most mornings on his phone in the guest room. He claimed to be job hunting, but Eleanor never heard him on actual calls. Mara handled the children with quiet efficiency, keeping them fed and entertained while maintaining an almost invisible presence in the house. The triplets were well behaved. Remarkably so. They spoke in complete sentences and shared toys without fighting. When Eleanor came home from work, they sometimes watched her with curious eyes but never approached without Mara's permission. On Thursday evening, Eleanor came home to find Daniel going through her mail. "What are you doing?" she asked. He looked up, unbothered. "Just checking to see if anything came for me. I had some documents forwarded here." "You forwarded mail to my address?" "Our address," he corrected casually. Yeah, I needed a permanent address for some paperwork. Hope that's okay. It wasn't okay. But Eleanor didn't argue. She took her mail from him and went to her room. Among the bills and advertisements was an envelope addressed to Daniel Hart from a law office in Scottsdale, Arizona. Eleanor held it up to the light. She could just make out the letterhead through the envelope. Jacobson and Associates. Family law. Family law. She set it aside and opened her laptop. A search for Jacobson and Associates revealed they specialized in divorce, custody disputes, and marital asset division. Eleanor pulled up a blank document and started making notes. Timeline inconsistencies she'd noticed. Daniel claimed he'd been in Phoenix rebuilding his life, but no digital footprint in Phoenix. Mara said the triplets were 3 years old, which meant they were conceived 7 years after he left. But when did Daniel and Mara actually meet? She pulled up her phone and scrolled to a photo Mara had posted on Facebook that morning. Eleanor had found Mara's profile the first night. The woman hadn't restricted her privacy settings. The post showed the triplets at what looked like a birthday party. Eleanor zoomed in on the background. There was a banner that read, "Happy 3rd birthday," but in the corner, barely visible, was a calendar on the wall. The month showed was August 2024. If they'd just turned 3 last month, like Mara said, they would have been born in late 2021, which meant Mara would have been pregnant in early 2021, which meant Daniel had been with Mara only 4 years after he left Eleanor, not 7 years. Where was he for those first 3 years? Eleanor grabbed her phone and called her friend Julia, who worked in HR at a healthcare company in Cleveland. "Hey," Julia answered. "What's up? Do you still have access to that employment verification database you told me about?" "Yeah, why?" "Can you run a name for me? Daniel Hart. I need to know where he worked between 2014 and now." "Is this about your ex?" "He's not technically my ex. We're still married." "Right, the guy who ghosted you. Why do you need this?" He came back. Silence on the line, then, "Excuse me?" "He showed up at my house 3 days ago with a whole other family. Says he was in Phoenix rebuilding his life. I need to know if that's true." "Jesus, Eleanor." Julia's keyboard clicked in the background. "Okay, give me a few minutes. I'll call you back." Eleanor hung up and continued her research. She pulled up property records for Cleveland Heights, searching for Daniel's name. Nothing after 2014. Then she searched Phoenix. Still nothing. But when she searched Scottsdale, the city where the law firm was located, she found something interesting. A property had been sold in 2018 under the name D. Hart. Not Daniel, just an initial. The sale price was $340,000. Eleanor cross-referenced the address with Google Maps. It was a modest ranch house in a suburban neighborhood, similar to hers. Her phone buzzed. Julia calling back. "Okay, this is weird," Julia said. "Daniel Hart shows employment at Midwest Medical Equipment through March 2014, like you knew. Then nothing until 2016 when he pops up at a company called Southwestern Healthcare Solutions in Tucson, Arizona." Tucson, not Phoenix? Tucson. He worked there until 2019. Then he shows up at a pharmaceutical distribution company in Scottsdale from 2019 to 2022. After that, nothing. Eleanor wrote it down. "Did you find a current address?" "No current address. Last known was in Scottsdale. Want me to send you the details?" "Please." After they hung up, Eleanor sat back and looked at her notes. Daniel hadn't been in Phoenix. He'd been in Tucson and Scottsdale, different cities. Which wasn't necessarily damning, except he'd specifically said Phoenix multiple times. And he'd been employed continuously until 2022, only a year ago. So why was he acting like he was desperate for work and stability? Eleanor heard footsteps in the hallway, a soft knock on her door. "Eleanor!" It was Mara's voice. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Eleanor opened the door. Mara stood there, looking uncertain. "Daniel's out with the kids. I thought maybe we could talk. Just us." Eleanor stepped aside, letting her in. Mara sat on the edge of the chair by Eleanor's desk. "I know this is awkward. I know you probably hate me." "I don't know you well enough to hate you," Eleanor said. "That's fair." Mara twisted her hands in her lap. "I just wanted to say that I didn't know about you. Not at first." "When did you find out?" "About 6 months ago. Daniel told me his previous marriage ended badly, that you'd separated years before we met, that the divorce was finalized. It wasn't. I know that now." Mara looked up, meeting Eleanor's eyes. "When I found out, I was furious. But by then we had the kids, and everything was complicated." That word again. "Why did you come here?" Eleanor asked. "Daniel said we needed a fresh start, that things fell apart in Arizona and we needed family support. I'm not his family anymore, and I'm definitely not yours." "I know, but he said you'd understand, that you were always understanding." Mara paused. "He was wrong about that, wasn't he?" Eleanor studied her. "What do you want, Mara?" "I want to know if he's lying to me the way he lied to you." There it was, the real question. "I think," Eleanor said carefully, "that Daniel tells the version of truth that serves him best in any given moment." Mara nodded slowly. "That's what I'm afraid of." "How did you two meet?" "At a hospital in Tucson. I was a nurse. He was doing sales rounds. He was charming and attentive, and I'd just gotten out of a bad relationship. It happened fast." "How fast?" 6 months from meeting to moving in together. I got pregnant right away. We weren't planning it, but he seemed happy about it. Then we found out it was triplets." "And he stayed?" "He did. He was good with them. Supportive during the pregnancy, present at the birth. That's why this doesn't make sense. Why would he bring us here, to his ex-wife's house?" Eleanor sat on her bed. "Have you seen his legal documents? Marriage license, birth certificates for the kids?" Mara frowned. "He handles all that stuff, the paperwork, the records. I've been focused on the kids." "You should ask to see them." "Why?" "Because I don't think everything is what he says it is." Mara's expression shifted from uncertain to worried. "What did you find?" "I'm not sure yet, but when I am, I'll let you know." The birth certificates arrived by email 3 days later. Eleanor had requested them through Ohio's Vital Records database, using her status as Daniel's legal spouse to access information about children born to him. What she found made her stomach drop. There were no birth certificates on file in Ohio for Marcus, Malcolm, and Mitchell Hart. She expanded the search to Arizona. Nothing. She tried California, Nevada, New Mexico. Still nothing. Either the children weren't registered under Daniel's last name, or they weren't registered at all. Eleanor printed out the negative search results and added them to the folder she'd been building. It now included property records, employment verification, timeline notes, and screenshots from Mara's social media. That evening, she came home to find Daniel sitting at her kitchen table with more papers spread out. "Good, you're here," he said. "I want to discuss next steps." Eleanor set down her bag. "What kind of next steps?" "Legal ones. I've been thinking about our situation, and I believe the fairest solution is to formally divide the marital assets. We file for legal separation, split the equity in the house, and move forward from there. You want to split the equity in a house you haven't paid a mortgage payment on in 10 years? I helped buy it. My name is on the deed. Ohio is an equitable distribution state, which means marital assets get divided fairly, not necessarily equally. Eleanor pulled out a chair and sat. And you've consulted a lawyer about this? I've done my research. In Scottsdale? His expression flickered. Just for a moment. What? You got mail from a law firm in Scottsdale. Family law specialists. I told you I had documents forwarded here. You also told me you were in Phoenix, but you weren't. You were in Tucson and Scottsdale. Daniel's jaw tightened. I moved around. Phoenix area broadly. Tucson is 2 hours from Phoenix. What's your point, Eleanor? My point is, you're not being honest about where you've been or what you've been doing, and now you show up with legal demands about a house you abandoned. I didn't abandon it. The police report says otherwise. Daniel stood. I don't have to explain myself to you. I'm offering you a fair deal. We can do this cooperatively, or we can involve courts and lawyers. Your choice. Then let's involve courts and lawyers, Eleanor said calmly. You want to fight this? I want the truth. Daniel's expression hardened. You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. No, I'm making it exactly as difficult as it is. He gathered his papers and left the kitchen. Eleanor heard him storm upstairs. She pulled out her phone and texted Julia. Need a family law attorney recommendation. Good one. The response came quickly. What happened? He wants to split the house equity. You're kidding. I wish. I'll send you a name. Valerie Torres. She's a shark. Handled my sister's divorce. She'll destroy him. An hour later, Eleanor was on the phone with Valerie Torres, explaining her situation. The attorney listened without interrupting, then let out a low whistle. Okay, so your husband vanished for 10 years, showed up with what he claims is a second family, and now wants to split assets from a house he hasn't contributed to in a decade? That's the summary, Eleanor said. And you suspect fraud? I suspect something. The children don't have birth certificates on file. His employment history doesn't match his story, and he knew my alarm code before he rang the doorbell. He what? The security log shows someone disarmed the system 30 minutes before he officially arrived. That's breaking and entering. Or he still had access he shouldn't have. Valerie was quiet for a moment. Eleanor, I'm going to be direct with you. This sounds like more than a simple marital asset dispute. This sounds like potential identity fraud, possibly bigamy, and definitely suspicious financial activity. Have you checked your credit report recently? I check it regularly. It's clean. Check again, and I want you to pull your bank records for the past 5 years. Look for anything unusual. Small withdrawals, unfamiliar deposits, anything that seems off. What are you thinking? I'm thinking your husband might have been accessing your accounts this whole time. If he knows your alarm code, what else does he know? Eleanor's blood went cold. She pulled up her bank account on her laptop while still on the phone. Recent transactions looked normal. She scrolled back. 6 months. A year. There. 3 years ago. A wire transfer out of her savings account for $5,000. She'd thought it was a bank error at the time. She'd called them, they'd investigated, told her it was a valid transfer with proper authorization. She'd accepted it as her own mistake. Maybe she'd authorized something and forgotten. But what if she hadn't? I found a wire transfer, Eleanor said. 3 years ago. $5,000. Do you remember authorizing it? No. Where did it go? Eleanor clicked into the details. The receiving account was listed as DH Financial Services, Scottsdale, Arizona. DH. Daniel Hart. It went to Scottsdale, she said quietly. To something called DH Financial Services. That's not a bank? I don't think so. Eleanor, I'm going to need you to file a police report. This is theft. This is wire fraud. This is way beyond a marital dispute. If I file a police report, this becomes criminal. It already is criminal. You're just deciding whether to do something about it. Eleanor looked at the computer screen, at the transaction she'd dismissed as her own error, at the pattern of deception that was starting to emerge. I'll file the report, she said. The detective assigned to Eleanor's case was a woman named Sandra Reeves, mid-40s, with short grey hair and the weary expression of someone who'd seen every variation of domestic deception. Walk me through this again, Detective Reeves said, sitting across from Eleanor in an interview room at the Columbus Police Department. Your husband disappeared in 2014, showed up last week with another family, and you've discovered he's been accessing your accounts. That's correct. And you suspect the children aren't legally registered. I ran searches in every state he claimed to have lived in. No birth certificates filed under his name. Reeves made notes. That's concerning. Children have to be registered. It's required for school enrollment, medical care, social services. Which makes me think they might be registered under a different name. Or not registered at all. If they're not registered, we have bigger problems. Reeves looked up. How old did you say they were? 3. And they're living in your house right now, yes? With your permission? Eleanor hesitated. They arrived without asking, but I haven't told them to leave. Why not? Because the children are innocent, and because I want to know what Daniel's really doing here. Reeves studied her. You're gathering evidence. I'm trying to understand what's happening. That's smart, but it's also dangerous. If your husband is involved in identity fraud, or has been siphoning money from your accounts, confronting him could escalate things. He doesn't know I've filed a report. He will once we start investigating. I'm going to need access to your financial records, your security system logs, any communication you've had with him. I'll also need to speak with the woman, Mara. Can you arrange that? I think so. And I'll need to verify those children's identities. If they're not registered, Child Protective Services will have to be involved. Eleanor's chest tightened. She'd wanted answers, but now the machinery of law enforcement was starting to move, and she wasn't sure she could control where it went. What happens to the kids if CPS gets involved? She asked. Depends on what we find. If the children are healthy and cared for, they might stay with Mara while we investigate. If there are concerns about their welfare or legal status, they could be placed in protective custody temporarily. Eleanor nodded slowly. One more thing, Reeves said. Has your husband been threatening? Not physically, but verbally, emotionally. He's been pushing for legal agreements, trying to establish rights to my property. That's control behavior, classic financial abuse. Reeves slid a business card across the table. If at any point you feel unsafe, call me immediately, don't wait. Eleanor took the card. When she arrived home that evening, Daniel was waiting. Where were you? He asked. No preamble, no pleasantries. I had errands. What kind of errands? Personal ones. He stepped closer. You're being evasive. I'm being private. There's a difference. We need to finalize things, Eleanor. I've been patient, but we're living in limbo here. I need answers about the house, about finances, about how long we can stay. You can stay as long as it takes for me to understand what's actually going on. What does that mean? Eleanor met his eyes. It means I don't believe you. Any of it. And I'm not making any decisions until I have the full truth. Daniel's expression went cold. You're calling me a liar? I'm saying your story doesn't add up. My story. I've been completely transparent. You said you were in Phoenix. You were in Tucson and Scottsdale. You said the kids just turned 3, but the timeline doesn't match. You said you needed a fresh start, but you're really here trying to claim rights to property you abandoned. I never abandoned anything. Then what do you call disappearing for 10 years? I call it surviving. Daniel's voice rose. I call it having to start over when everything fell apart. What fell apart, Daniel? What was so terrible that you couldn't tell your wife, that you couldn't call or write or explain? He turned away. You wouldn't understand. Try me. I got into debt, serious debt, the kind that doesn't just go away. I had people looking for me. I had to disappear. Eleanor's heart pounded. What kind of debt? Gambling, cards, sports betting. It started small and spiraled. I owed money to people who don't accept payment plans. So you left me to deal with it. They weren't looking for you. They were looking for me. And you just decided to let me think you were dead? To let me grieve and struggle and rebuild while you were in Arizona starting over? I was protecting you. You were protecting yourself. Eleanor's voice cracked. Don't rewrite this as some noble sacrifice. You ran, and now you're back because you need something. Daniel's jaw worked. Fine. You want the truth? I'm broke. The business I started in Scottsdale failed. Mara doesn't know that. She thinks we're temporarily short on cash, but the reality is I'm in deep again. I owe money and I need assets to leverage. So you came here to take mine? To access what's rightfully half mine? Eleanor laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. You think any court is going to give you equity in a house you abandoned? After you committed wire fraud by stealing from my accounts? Daniel went still. What did you say? The wire transfer. 3 years ago. DH Financial Services. That was you. His face drained of color. You can't prove that. Actually, I can. And I have. I filed a police report this afternoon. The room went silent. Daniel stared at her. And for the first time since he'd arrived, Eleanor saw genuine fear in his eyes. You called the cops on me? I reported a crime. Do you have any idea what you've done? I've protected myself. Daniel's hands clenched. You stupid. He caught himself, bit back whatever he was about to say. This is going to blow back on you. If they investigate me, they investigate everything, including you. I have nothing to hide. Everyone has something to hide, Eleanor. He grabbed his jacket and stormed out. The front door slammed hard enough to rattle the windows. Mara appeared in the hallway, holding one of the triplets. Her face was pale. What's happening? She asked. Eleanor looked at her. The truth is happening. Daniel didn't come back that night, or the next morning. Mara sat at Eleanor's kitchen table, the triplets playing quietly in the living room, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold. He called once, Mara said, around midnight, said he needed space to think. Did he say where he was going? A motel somewhere. He wouldn't tell me which one. She looked up at Eleanor. What did you mean yesterday, when you said the truth is happening? Eleanor made a decision. She went upstairs and returned with her folder, the timeline, the property records, the employment verification, the missing birth certificates. She spread it all on the table. This is what I've found, she said. Mara looked through the papers, her expression growing more stricken with each page. "The kids don't have birth certificates," she whispered. "Not under Daniel's name. Not in any state I searched. But they have to. I was at the hospital when they were born. Tucson Medical Center. I held them. I named them." "What did Daniel tell you about registering them?" "That he'd handle it. That he'd file all the paperwork." Mara's hands were shaking. "I had postpartum complications, severe anxiety, some depression. I couldn't focus on administrative things for months. He said he'd take care of it." "Did you ever see the completed certificates?" "He showed me something, papers with their names and birth dates. I assumed they were official." Eleanor pulled out her phone and opened the search results. "These are from the Arizona Department of Health Services. No records for your children under Hart." "Maybe they're under my name." Mara's voice was desperate. "My last name is Bennett." Eleanor had already checked. She shook her head. Mara put her face in her hands. "Oh God, what has he done?" "I think," Eleanor said carefully, "that Daniel has been operating under multiple identities. And I think he's been moving money and assets in ways that aren't legal. The question is why. He told me he was a medical equipment sales rep, that he made good money. We lived in a nice house in Scottsdale for a while." "The house that was sold in 2018? He said it was rented." "It was sold for $340,000. Where did that money go?" Mara looked lost. "I don't know. He manages our finances." "Has he ever shown you tax returns, bank statements?" "He says I don't need to worry about that stuff, that he handles the business side and I handle the kids." Eleanor felt a surge of anger, not at Mara, but at Daniel, for exploiting this woman's trust, for isolating her from information that was rightfully hers. "Mara, I need to ask you something important. Have you ever filed a marriage license?" "Of course. We got married in Vegas. It was quick, but it was legal." "When?" 3 years ago, right after the boys were born." Eleanor's chest tightened. "Do you have a copy of the license?" "Daniel has it, with all our other documents." "Where?" "In a lockbox. He keeps it in whatever bedroom we're staying in." Eleanor stood. "Can you get it?" "Now?" "Right now." They went upstairs. Mara opened the guest room closet and pulled out a small fireproof box. It was locked. "Do you have the key?" Eleanor asked. "Daniel carries it." Eleanor looked at the box. It was standard, the kind sold at office supply stores. The lock was simple. "Wait here," she said. She went to her bedroom and found a paperclip. Straightened it. Bent the end. It took 3 tries, but the lock clicked open. Inside were documents. Birth certificates. Blank ones. Unfilled. A fake passport with Daniel's photo, but a different name. Credit cards in names Eleanor didn't recognize. And at the bottom, a marriage license. Eleanor pulled it out. It was real. Issued in Clark County, Nevada. 3 years ago. The names were Daniel Hart and Mara Bennett, which meant Daniel had committed bigamy, because his marriage to Eleanor had never been dissolved. Mara saw Eleanor's expression. "What? What is it?" "He married you while still married to me," Eleanor said quietly. Mara swayed. Eleanor caught her arm, steadied her. "That's not possible," Mara whispered. "It's not legal, but it happened." "But we—" Mara's voice broke. I thought I was his wife. I thought we were a family. You are a family, just not a legal one. The implications crashed over Mara. The children born to an invalid marriage. The years of believing she had legal protections, rights, status, all of it built on fraud. Eleanor's phone buzzed. Detective Reeves. Ms. Hart, we've located your husband. He's at a motel in Akron. We're bringing him in for questioning regarding the wire fraud. But we need you to come down to the station. There are some things we need to discuss. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Eleanor looked at Mara. I have to go to the police station. Will you be okay here with the kids? What's going to happen? Mara asked. I don't know. But whatever it is, you need to protect yourself. And your children. How? Eleanor picked up the box full of fake documents. By telling the truth, all of it. The Columbus Police Department conference room smelled like old coffee and fluorescent light. Daniel sat at a table, his confidence from a week ago completely evaporated. He looked exhausted, cornered. Detective Reeves sat across from him, Eleanor beside her. A lawyer Eleanor didn't recognize sat next to Daniel. Let's go through this again, Reeves said. You married Mara Bennett in 2019 while still legally married to Eleanor Hart. I thought the marriage was over, Daniel said. We'd been separated for years. Separation doesn't equal divorce, Mr. Hart, you know that. His lawyer leaned in. My client made an error in judgment. Your client committed bigamy. He also committed wire fraud by accessing his legal wife's accounts without permission. And based on what we've found, he's been operating under multiple aliases. Reeves slid documents across the table. Financial records, the fake IDs from the lockbox, employment records showing gaps and inconsistencies. We pulled your credit report, Mr. Hart. Or should I say, your credit reports. You have accounts under 3 different variations of your name. Daniel R. Hart, D. Richard Hart, Richard D. Hart, each with different addresses, different employment listed. Daniel didn't respond. You also have outstanding debts, totaling approximately $180,000. Credit cards, personal loans, gambling debts. You've been shuffling money between accounts, using balance transfers and cash advances to stay afloat. Eleanor's stomach turned. She'd had no idea the scale of what Daniel had been doing. Where are the children's birth certificates? Reeves asked. They exist, Daniel said. They're registered. Under what name? Mara's. We checked. They're not registered under Bennett either. Daniel's lawyer whispered something to him. Daniel shook his head. Mr. Hart, if those children aren't legally registered, we have to assume there's a reason. Were they born in a hospital? Yes. Which one? Tucson Medical Center. On what date? Daniel rattled off a date in September 3 years ago. Reeves made a note. We'll verify that. But I'm going to be honest with you, this looks very bad. Wire fraud, bigamy, identity fraud, failure to register children. You're looking at federal charges. I didn't hurt anyone, Daniel said, his voice rising. I made mistakes, but I didn't hurt anyone. You stole from your wife, Reeves said flatly. You lied to Mara Bennett. You created a fraudulent identity. How is that not hurting people? Eleanor finally spoke. Why did you come back? Daniel looked at her. For the first time, she saw something real in his expression. Desperation. Because I had nowhere else to go, he said quietly. Everything fell apart. I owed people money I couldn't pay. I thought if I could just get equity from the house, I could settle some debts and start over. I thought you'd be reasonable. You thought I'd be easy to manipulate, Eleanor corrected. I thought you'd remember we were married once, that meant something. It did mean something, until you disappeared. Daniel's shoulders slumped. He looked older suddenly, defeated. His lawyer cleared his throat. Detective, if my client cooperates fully, what are we looking at? That depends on the extent of the fraud and whether restitution is possible, but at minimum, prison time. The word hung in the air. Eleanor felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness. This man had been her husband once. They'd made plans, shared dreams, and now he was sitting in a police interrogation room facing federal charges. What about Mara and the kids? Eleanor asked. We're working with Child Protective Services, Reeves said. The children need proper legal documentation, and Mara needs to establish guardianship. She's been cooperating fully. She didn't know, Eleanor said, about any of it. We believe her. She's a victim here too. Daniel looked up sharply. She's not a victim. She has the kids. She has 3 unregistered children, no legal marriage, and no financial security because you lied to her, Reeves interrupted. Yes, Mr. Hart. She's a victim. The interview lasted another hour, with Daniel's lawyer negotiating terms of cooperation. By the end, Daniel had agreed to provide full financial disclosure, to cooperate with the birth certificate registration, and to plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a lighter sentence. When Eleanor finally left the station, it was nearly dark. She sat in her car in the parking lot for a long time, watching the streetlights flicker on. Her phone buzzed. Mara. Is it over? The message read. Almost, Eleanor replied. 6 weeks later, Eleanor sat on her back porch, a mug of tea cooling in her hands. The house was quiet again. Mara and the children had moved into a small apartment in downtown Columbus, with help from social services and a non-profit that assisted victims of fraud. The children were registered, properly documented, and enrolled in a preschool program. Daniel had pleaded guilty to wire fraud and bigamy. He was serving 18 months in federal prison, with restitution payments required to Eleanor for the money he'd stolen. The house was hers again, legally and fully. Daniel had signed over his rights as part of his plea agreement. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like silence. Not the silence of absence this time, but the silence after a storm, when everything settles and you assess the damage. Eleanor had taken a week off work to process everything. Her supervisor had been understanding, supportive even. She'd spent the time cleaning, clearing out the guest rooms, reorganizing closets, reclaiming space. But mostly she'd spent it thinking. About the 10 years she'd lost waiting for answers that never came. About the moment she'd opened the door and seen Daniel again. About how close she'd come to letting him manipulate her into compliance. Her phone rang. Valerie Torres, her attorney. How are you holding up? Valerie asked. I'm okay. You're allowed to not be okay, you know. I know. I'm calling because the court finalized everything. Your divorce decree came through. You're officially single. Eleanor absorbed that. Officially single. After 10 years of limbo, after weeks of chaos, it was done. Thank you, she said. I should be thanking you. Your case was remarkable. The documentation you gathered, the timeline you built, it made the prosecution's job easy. I just wanted the truth. You wanted justice. There's a difference. Valerie paused. What are you going to do now? I don't know. Maybe travel. I haven't taken a real vacation in years. You should. You've earned it." After they hung up, Eleanor sat with the word. Justice. It felt too big, too formal for what had actually happened. She hadn't destroyed Daniel out of revenge. She'd simply refused to let him rewrite reality. Silence hadn't been her weakness. It had been her clarity. By not reacting, by not screaming or crying or immediately throwing him out, she'd given him space to reveal himself, to make mistakes, to show patterns, to expose his own lies. And when she'd finally acted, she'd done so with evidence, with strategy, with precision. That was power, not the loud kind, not the kind that demands attention, the quiet kind, the kind that observes, documents, and acts only when the moment is right. Eleanor heard a car pull into the driveway. Mara appeared around the side of the house, carrying a casserole dish. "Hi," Mara said. "I know I should have called first, but I made lasagna and thought you might want some. The boys helped. It's messy, but edible." Eleanor smiled. Over the past weeks, she and Mara had developed an unlikely friendship. Two women connected by one man's betrayal, finding solidarity in survival. "Come in," Eleanor said. They ate on the back porch, talking about small things. The boys' adjustment to preschool. Mara's new job at a medical clinic. Eleanor's upcoming work project. "Have you heard from him?" Mara asked eventually. "No. Have you?" "One letter. Apologizing. Asking me to bring the boys to visit. Will you?" Mara was quiet for a long time. "I don't know. Part of me thinks they should know their father. But another part thinks they're better off without him. What do the boys remember? Not much. They were so young. Sometimes they ask where Daddy went. And I tell them he had to go away for work. I don't know how to explain it properly without making them feel abandoned." Eleanor understood that better than most. "They won't feel abandoned if they have you," Eleanor said. "That's what matters." Mara's eyes filled. "Thank you. For everything. For not throwing us out that first night. For helping me understand what was happening. You helped me too. You told the truth when it mattered. It was the least I could do." They sat in comfortable silence as the evening deepened around them. Later, after Mara left, Eleanor went inside and stood in her living room. She looked at the space she'd reclaimed, the life she'd rebuilt twice now. The first time after Daniel disappeared, she'd done it alone. This time she'd done it with clarity. And this time, she knew exactly who she was. Eleanor Hart, project manager, survivor, woman who refused to be rewritten by someone else's narrative. She opened her laptop and pulled up a folder titled Future. Inside was research she'd been collecting, travel destinations, photography classes at the community college, volunteer opportunities with women's shelters, things she'd been too busy or too broken or too cautious to pursue before. Not anymore. She clicked on a link for a photography workshop in Seattle and filled out the registration form. Then she closed the laptop and walked to the window. The neighborhood was quiet, peaceful. Lights glowed in windows up and down the street. Normal lives continuing, unaware of the small drama that had unfolded in the ranch house with the grey shutters. That was fine with Eleanor. She didn't need witnesses or applause. She just needed her truth and her silence, which had never been empty. It had been full of strength, observation, and the patience to wait for exactly the right moment to act. Eleanor smiled to herself in the darkening room. Then she turned off the light and went to bed. End.